Welcome to the Uncommon Living podcast, where we host dialogues in human resilience. I'm Thomas Seager. I'm an associate professor in the School of Sustainable Engineering at Arizona State University and the CEO of the Morozko Forge Ice Bath Company. My guest in today's episode is Dr. Rick Cohen. Rick was educated as a biomedical engineer before he went to graduate school for med school. What Rick pointed out is health is not your current state. It cannot be captured in a single lab report. Health is your ability to heal. You have to capture dynamic measures to capture health. And he talks us through some of the favorite measures that will indicate your ability to transition between two different states. He'll tell you about orthostatic heart rate. He'll tell you about his breath hold index and how the ice bath improved his breath hold after a long flight. And he'll tell you why VO2 Max is not the be-all, end-all health measure that some social media influencers suggest.
Dr. Rick Cohen, thanks for joining me on the Uncommon Living podcast.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled to be here.
You and I have been talking a lot about resilience these past few days. We've been trading emails about some of the assessment metrics that you're assembling in under the umbrella of what you call quantum mitochondrial terrain.
Correct.
And one of the things that you pointed out is that VO2 Max is an oversimplification that is being touted in social media as sort of the ultimate longevity fitness measure. It reminded me of a story. I had my VO2 Max done at Optispan in Seattle, and it was terrifying, really. I stayed on that treadmill as long as I possibly could. I was afraid I was going to throw up in the mask, and I said, okay, I got to call it quits. I passed out on the floor, and they gave me my result. It was something terrible, like 26, you know? I texted that to my media manager back at Morozko, and she said, congratulations, you're going to die in 7 years. It didn't feel right. What's wrong with VO2 Max, Doc?
Yeah. Okay. Well, one, we don't want you to die during the experience. So I think I always like to start practically, right? So a practical example would be if you're not fit, and if we clearly know someone is not fit as a practitioner, right? Why are we taking someone and say, when's the last time you went as hard as you possibly could? And now you're going to do it for us now. One, I don't even know what the purpose is of that. We clearly know someone isn't fit. So what good is it doing?
I think you're saying we don't need a VO2 Max to identify a couch potato.
We don't need a VO2 Max to identify a couch potato. So it's a risk. It's an unnecessary burden on someone. I mean, that's sort of one point that.
But why do people why do people think of VO2 Max as this longevity measure?
Because that's what we're hearing all the time.
They tell us this over and over again.
Yeah, probably a day goes by without some social media post. The most important marker that you can have for health is longevity is VO2 Max. So I'm not quite sure where and how that started and who propagated it. And in today's world of social media, things catch on. Even in the medical field.
It's not entirely specious. We know that a greater VO2 max means that your body can achieve a higher state of power generation or peak power generation. This is the amount of oxygen that you're capable of consuming in respiration per body weight per minute.
Correct.
And if you have a high VO2 max, your lungs have to be in good shape, your circulatory system has to be in good shape, your mitochondria have to be in good shape. All these things are going to power that high level of respiration. How can that be a bad thing?
Okay, good question, right? It's a good question. So let's take one point. You mentioned your mitochondria have to be in good shape. What does that mean, right? So what does good shape in mitochondria mean? And I'm going to use the analogy of a Ferrari engine, right? So when we do VO2 max, think of we're measuring your horsepower. How hard or fast your engine, your car can go.
Yep.
You know, it's not an exact correlation, but it's a way to imagine it. Now, let's say you had a 600 horsepower engine and you could go really, really, really fast. Now, how many miles per gallon are you getting?
Not a lot.
Not a lot, right? So in energy production, in the mitochondria, you know, whether we're talking fat oxidation or glucose oxidation or actually proton flow, which ultimately, you know, in a quantum, you know, small micro state where we're looking at actually energy flow, there's proton moving, but then there's also what you call waste products of, and we call it redox, right? So there's how your body handles that energy. And you can have, just like in a Ferrari, something that goes really, really fast, but it's spewing a lot of inflammatory, oxidative products. And I know that in working with athletes, right? So people who have trained their whole life to be a competitive athlete have to push themselves really hard. And that requires going red line, right? You would never think about taking your car all the time and driving 120 miles an hour.
That's a great point.
Right?
Yeah.
You're going to need oil. You're going to have to frequently maintain that car because you're going to burn out parts. Well, that's what happens in your body. Now, it's good to have an engine that might go fast, but is that how we live our lives? Okay, so that's one thing. We're looking at a marker of something we really never do, right? It's not a marker of how we live. And well, there's so many pieces to get into this, but let me promulgate this idea, right? It's not how hard you go, it's how efficient you are. You know, we're going to go back to the car, how efficient you are at cruise, right? Can you go 75 miles per hour and get 60 miles per gallon and never have to, you know, and change your oil or maybe your electric car, go 20,000 miles, right? Really efficient. You know, it's an electric car, it's not spewing or it's hydrogen and it's just water coming out of the tailpipe. Isn't that what you want to be? And then I would take it even another step further is it important, how many times do you need to go 200 miles an hour in life? Like virtually never, unless you're a highly competitive cross-country skier or, you know, a Tour de France rider who's, and even, you know, even them, they don't go all out all the time. Right? They actually have a particular threshold.
Sure.
It's the ability to accelerate and slow down and recover, right? So can your body move fast or harder for a period of time, rest and recover, and then move hard again?
Okay, let's talk about that then. I did a video, maybe from my ice bath, in which I was asking the question, what is health? We think of health as a state. That is, it is a snapshot of your condition at a certain time. In thermodynamics, pressure is a state variable. Temperature is a state variable. So health would be a state that describes the body. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. When we think about health as a noun, it makes it sound like it is a state variable. The real way to think about health is not as a state, but as the difference between two states. Your capacity to heal is health. Heal is a verb. You cannot think of health as a noun. You must think of health as something you do rather than as something that you have. So in my VO2 Max test, I'm passed out on the floor. I'm breathing hard on my back. What nobody bothered to measure is how long did it take for my pulse to come back to what might be a typical resting pulse rate for me. That is the difference between two states, stressed and unstressed.
Exactly.
What's
your recovery capacity from pushing to that level? And that's actually more important than how hard you can go. It's really how fast you can recover to do it again.
So this makes a lot of sense to me. In resilient infrastructure engineering, which is, you know, several publications, has been my thing for the last 10, 15 years at ASU. We're studying adaptive and resilient infrastructure. We think of it the same way. Resilience is not something that you have. It's not an emergency backup generator. It is your capacity to bring that generator online. It is your capacity to adapt. Resilience is better thought of as a verb. I think health is better thought of as a verb. And an example that's more accessible is a bone. You may have osteoporosis. You say, well, that's not healthy, but the bone is intact. If the bone breaks, health is how quickly does it heal. It's not the state, it is the action of moving between two states.
Correct.
You might not have osteoporosis. You might have a very healthy bone. We could test the health of your bone. And how would we do this? We would apply so much force that we break it. We would call the bone break max metric. And we'd say it's the single most important metric of any metric that you should just go into the lab and you should get that bone broken. And we're going to see how strong your bones really are. And everybody would say, oh, it's better to have strong bones than weak bones, isn't it? And that's not health. The health is how quickly does the broken bone heal?
How fast, and we all know, right? A 25 or 20-year-old can sprain an ankle, or they can get a cold or a flu, and they're back at it 2 days later. Like literally, you can watch NCAA, these guys severely sprain an ankle and they're playing next week.
Yeah.
And if that were a 60 or 70-year-old person who was not fit, they'd be out for weeks and weeks.
Sure.
So they've lost resiliency that is present when we're youthful. Same thing for someone, it's one of the reasons that people who don't have disease, die in essence. They get an infection, that they have the resiliency.
You can't fight it off.
They don't have the resiliency to recover from it.
Yeah, so now it's pneumonia.
So now it's a pneumonia, and you don't have the resiliency to protect yourself. So that's a really key point.
If not VO2 max, then tell me about the measures that you're developing that would be a better indication of health from this resilience perspective.
Got it. So I think we just talked about resilience and dynamic measurements. And that's really, and we talked about how it's sort of more important to understand how the body is performing at a steady state, high output level, but at a steady state and recovery. And we also know, car analogy seems to be working, it would be nice to measure what the RPMs are doing at this particular, right? I'm going 70, is my RPM 6,000 or are they 2,000, right?
Yeah.
Maybe I'm in the wrong gear.
How hard are you working in order to maintain a certain performance level is an interesting way to think
Exactly,
about it.
right?
Yeah.
So a lot of this work is based on experience with cyclists. My wife happens to be a competitive triathlete and cyclist, so spent many years sort of working with her, and the thing that helps her more than anything is monitoring and metrics. So what she knows is that there's something called a functional threshold, right? So the functional threshold is this cruise speed that your body switches from a more efficient fat-burning metabolism to burning glucose. It's like it's going too fast, right?
Yeah.
And if the analogy we always use is a fire. Like
Okay.
you can have a big hot fire and it's burning thick logs, and it's hot and it's really good and it's going to burn for hours. But it's never as big as if you throw twigs and newspapers, right? It blows up. So at a certain point, to get that additional speed, you need to throw twigs and newspapers, and that's the glucose, the glycolysis. Not as efficient, and also has waste associated with it. It's a different process. That waste in the body is in an acid form, lactic acid, which actually has a benefit. We can talk about it in a moment, but if you're doing a steady state, you get burned, and that's sort of like my legs are burning, I can't go anymore. We all know that experience. If you're doing a 2 or 3 hour endurance run or triathlon, you can't have that. You might be a short bit, but you need to know that, okay, it's called a functional threshold. At what point, based on my heart rate and power, am I going to hit that zone where I switch from fat to glucose.
How do you determine functional threshold?
There's a variety of different metrics to do that. You can do that off of the same metabolic testing that measures VO2 max. You can do that with a mask, and you can measure CO2, O2 when it shifts. So at that point, when you're breathing more carbon dioxide, it becomes glycolysis. So you can do that. You can also do testing where you measure lactate. You can actually measure blood lactate at particular thresholds. So you would start off with like 100 watts on a bike, and you would step every 4 minutes and check your lactate, and you can create a curve. And there's algorithms now that can create a particular assessment, and tells you exactly when the lactate shot up. So that's your point. There are also ways to look at, which is what we're using now. We do the lactate testing, but that's only periodically, right? Because you still have to use you have to do a finger stick or an ear stick.
Okay.
And it's not that hard to do.
Yeah.
But you can do a regular test where you look at a particular, there's something called heart rate variability. I'm just using that as a term. I'm going to change that to cardiac rhythm frequency analysis, right?
All right.
So we hear heart rate variability, and for the most part, Aura or Whoop or all these, they give you lots of numbers, but they generally sort of, for lack of a better word, dumb it down to one particular number, which is based on population base, and they typically just use something called RMSSD, and
Root mean square
standard deviation, right? It's a logarithm between, and it's a fine marker, but there's other frequency spectrums that you can pay attention to. There's one unique frequency spectrum that you can observe that requires a different strap or a different transmitter or device.
You can't get it from a ring.
You can't get it from a ring, and you can't even get it from a Polar or a normal heart rate strap, a Garmin, or anything you might use for cycling, because they're not EKG based.
Okay.
Right? So you need at least a single lead EKG. They're same size, but they're more expensive, and they require more sophisticated algorithms.
Okay.
But when you use that device, you can pick up a particular nonlinear metric. It's a different frequency. We'll just leave it, and that will change during a ride, and you can determine it then at what point you're flipping
So when a cyclist gets a signal that they're close to flipping, they might decide to back off so that they don't flip?
Well, yes and no. They're just bringing in lactate monitors now, so that by sweat. So ideally, that's their gold standard.
Yeah.
It's like they would level lactate because they know exactly when they go up, because it could vary, but typically they train enough. So for my wife, she knows 220 watts is probably her functional threshold.
Okay.
And for her, she's determined that through some of the tests we've talked about.
Yeah.
But she knows if she, through her training, over 220, she starts to experience lactate accumulation.
Okay.
Like, she just doesn't feel as good. She knows. So she'll sit at 200 to 210, and she's fit enough that she can stay at that speed for hours, because she's able to clear, and she has the ability to continue delivering oxygen. She has super dense mitochondrial, cellular density, so she can stay there. Now, that works. So the analogy is for her, right? She can go at 70, 80 miles for hours. Now, that's different than the acceleration. Okay, so I'm just using the performance metric. Like, if you're a mountain biker and you're going up and down, while you need the endurance capacity to do a 3-4 hour race, it's not steady state. You need to be able to accelerate and recover, and accelerate and recover. So you're actually, when you do a push up a hill, you're going over, right? You need to throw twigs and sticks onto the fire, right? So you need to switch into glycolysis. And at that point, you start accumulating lactate. Turns out lactate actually can be used for energy, and you get like a turbo boost.
Okay.
Which is fine. But, and as we said before, what if you start to burn in your legs? So you might make it up the hill once. So a really good mountain biker has a very fast lactate clearance.
Okay.
Right? And this is their resilience.
Sure.
So they can go up the hill once, recover really quickly for the next hill.
I know, though, that you have a suite of measures that you've developed to assess the physiological resilience, or maybe even the psychological resilience of the subject, whether they're an athlete or not. And I want to ask you to describe them for me because they make a lot of sense, and I've never heard them from someone else. For example, what is orthostatic heart rate?
Orthostatic heart rate is your change in heart rate when you go from a lying to standing state. And it's like a simple metric, and I urge everyone to sort of
Okay,
see.
so you get up out of bed.
Right, so you're lying in bed. It's, you know, you could do it any time, but, you know, to get an idea of where you are in the morning, lie in bed, check. You can do a manual, or if you're wearing a pulse meter, whatever it might be. It's easier manual without a device that does better heart rate averaging, because if you wear a heart rate strap, you'll see the heart rate changes very rapidly.
Yeah.
So it's good for a more steady state.
Okay.
But, you know, as you're getting up, it'll go 60 and you take a deep breath and it's going up and it's going down and it's going up, and so it's not as precise. So take a manual heart rate.
Measure your pulse.
Measure your pulse.
Yeah.
Stand up.
Okay.
And then about at second 55, start counting a little bit before, and then count the beats from second 55 to 70, and that's 15 seconds. Times it by 4. So a person with a good autonomic nervous system that is trained in a recovery state or in a resilient state, their heart rate should be less than 10 beats a minute difference. So if they were
difference, okay.
Right. So if they were 60 lying down, at that 55 to 70, that count should be no more than 17. Right, 17 times 4 would be 68.
Okay, gotcha.
So the difference between 60 and 68 would be 8. And that would be a good resilient.
So your orthostatic heart rate
Orthostatic
is the difference between lying down, resting heart rate, and you just stood up. So it's the difference between these two states, not a single state
It's
variable.
not a set, it's a difference.
Okay, why is that important?
Well, as I mentioned, it's a marker of resilience, right? It's a marker of the body, the ability of your body to compensate for a change in state.
Okay.
Right. So
you
think
get
about
up,
it. If
and
you're
now gravity is acting on your blood, and it might be draining out of your head or whatever, and so now your
and
body has to
what's
compensate.
your body has to compensate, and
Okay.
that's driven by the nervous system.
All right.
Right. So a body that's resilient and is very parasympathetic calming can do that really easily.
So a low orthostatic heart rate, that is a low difference between the resting, lying down pulse and the standing up pulse. A low orthostatic heart rate is indicative of a body that's very adaptive. It does not have to work very hard to adapt to the changing conditions.
Right.
A high orthostatic heart rate is your body saying, "Oh my God, what did you do to us? You stood up? Come on, fella! Now look at all this work we have to do." So
You're reactive, and I use my wife and I as difference. She's a Ferrari that has is more sensitive. I'm more of a hybrid, right?
Okay.
So her resting heart rate is 42. She'll get up, it'll go to 47.
You're sure she's alive?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Like sometimes it's like, okay, is your heart beating?
Sounds very low, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So for me, my resting heart rate is, at night is 58, 60 or so.
Yeah.
But it's like, I can sit up from 60 and it'll go to 66. I'll
Sounds like
stand up,
nothing.
right? I'll stand up, I'll go 60, I might go to 80,
Whoa.
right, at times.
Okay.
So that is an area of sensitivity to me, and it's something I'm working on, and we can talk more about. I actually followed some particular health, how should I put it? Intermittent fasting, HIIT training, high strength, short Tabata workouts. So that was like the core of what I
these
did.
make a difference in your orthostatic heart rate?
No, they made me more sympathetic driven. So
Gotcha.
here I thought these are the good things to do,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And this is the key. We listen. Oh, these are good things to do.
Yeah.
But in
You're going
actuality,
to work out. You're going to work that sympathetic nervous system. You're going to get into that fight or flight mode, and you're going to push through that HIIT workout.
right? So
Okay.
I'm naturally more sensitive. So we all have a particular archetype or particular, it's just who we are, right? Everyone's a little bit different in multiple different ways. I'm more sensitive to that.
Mm-hmm.
And so here I was training my body to be more sympathetic,
Mm-hmm.
which is my weakness. I really needed to focus on more parasympathetic.
Interesting.
Right? So I was creating this weakness and making it more of a pattern
Yeah.
for me. So I'm working on that, and it's improving. Now, going back to my wife, like she's much more parasympathetic. She can walk up around 15 minutes and then go back, and she's still good,
Mm-hmm.
right? And she can do, which is another marker, is when we look at cardiac frequency analysis. She's up 10 or 15 minutes. It doesn't really matter for her.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm up 10 or 15 minutes, it'll affect my baseline
Mm-hmm.
metrics. So
Right.
we need to be aware of who we are and the problems. And then there's always U-shaped curves.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were someone who had a 50 or 60 heart rate and it only went to 62, that's probably not good either,
Gotcha.
right?
Yeah.
So there's
Because maybe that reveals that your capacity for adaptation is poor.
Is-
You should have a little bit
You
more.
should have a
Yeah,
bump. Yeah,
that makes
you
sense.
should naturally. So there's good and bad with that, and we could probably get back to about VO2 max, because they're, if we want to, and we can continue talking metrics, but I know we've spoken about VO2 max as there's some pieces about what's the greatest benefit, or where the correlations to VO2 max and population studies, right, and not individuals, and how VO2 max is a marker. It's a marker based on population studies. It's another point that suggests people whose VO2 max, who went from, well, it's not even a change. Like they looked at large population data sets and they said, your VO2 max is 25. Here was your health status, and here's how long you lived, or your risk of dying. It's called all mortality risk, which is a really nebulous term.
Sure.
And we can flip this. And they looked at people whose VO2 max is 40, and they looked at all mortality risk.
Okay, so we measure the VO2 max and we correlate this with all-cause mortality, and then we might infer from this data cloud and create a regression that a higher VO2 max, at least to a point, is associated with lower all-cause mortality. If we have the data for this, say, oh, well, that means you're going to live a longer life.
Do you know what all-cause mortality? Can you actually say what all-cause mortality is?
Death.
Yeah, I don't know. What's your percentage of dying more? But that's different. Like, if your percentage, and we'll flip this. If you're 20, what's your risk of dying?
It's pretty low.
1 in 10,000 the next year. So what if your all-cause mortality doubled? It's 2 in 1,000. It's still pretty dang low, right?
Gotcha.
If you're at 70, maybe it's 1 in 10.
Yeah.
Okay, now 10 to 20% is a little more significant. It's still pretty low.
So this is, once again, the difference between relative risk and absolute risk. The difference between 1 in 10,000 and 2 in 10,000, relatively, it's twice. But absolutely, it's still a minuscule difference of 1 over 10,000.
Right.
The difference between 1 out of 10 and 2 out of 10 has the same relative risk. It's 2. But the difference in absolute risk is enormous.
It's enormous. So I could do a really good post. Take your VO2 max, or if your VO2 max is 40 over 25, you can raise your.
What does that mean, 40 over 25?
Well, if you went from, if we said 20-year-olds, right? Let's just take that example,
Yeah.
20-year-olds. If it's 25 and you're 20-year-old and you're 40 at 20-year-old, 100% less chance relative risk.
Okay.
All mortality risk.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Absolutely nothing.
Okay.
1 in 10,000 versus 2 in 10,000,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
whatever the exact
Yeah.
numbers is, but it's pretty dang low.
Okay.
So age plays a role. And then it doesn't really even look at your individual person, right? Which is
correct. So anytime we're taking an individual measure and then we're comparing to this ensemble of the general population, it might lead to hypotheses or generalizations that are really oversimplifications. It is always a logical fallacy to reason from the general, that is the statistical ensemble, and say, well, that says something specific about the individual.
That's correct.
In my case, I had some consolation in my crappy VO2 max that said I am cardiovascularly unhealthy. Now, to put in perspective, I'm an overweight, sedentary college professor. I'm not supposed to be maxing out my VO2 max, at least not with the lifestyle that I have. But many of my strength measures were great, and I had a really good standing broad jump, and I was proud of myself. It wasn't until I got to VO2 max that my attendant there looked all disappointed. I also had a DEXA scan that day. And what it showed is that my bone density, at least for my age, is in something like the 99.6th percentile. I have extraordinarily dense bones. And my rationalization, my cope on my poor VO2 max levels was that it's divided by your body mass. The bones are not metabolically engaged in a VO2 max. And so I'm carrying all this extra weight in my skeleton that makes my VO2 max look a little lower.
A little lower, exactly. And again, doesn't sound like they gave you where your lactate threshold or that functional threshold was. So where you switch from beta fat. So, and the problem with VO2 max is it's effort sometimes driven, like who can push a little bit further.
Yeah.
So let's get back to...
Well,
let's get back to the other
point being, it's not the absolute number compared to the ensemble.
Yes.
It is the number compared to me.
Yes.
Is it going down? Is it going up? What's the right VO2 max for me?
Right.
Not a data set that I might or may not belong to.
Correct. And the problem with VO2 max is, and we talked before, is like, how often can you do that?
Never.
Once right? You don't want to do it again.
Right.
Right. It's like, it's not fun to do.
It's expensive and it's
expensive
intensive.
And it's intensive. You're wearing a mask and you might either be running or on a bike, and it's like, that's not fun. No. I don't want to do that. So the whole experience is sort of stressful. And that's why doing something sub-max. So not only are we looking at a marker that really isn't showing resilience, and not only we're looking at marker that is population-based and isn't necessarily telling us if you take your personal VO2 max from 25 to 40, it's going to benefit you. We don't know that. We don't know exactly how that's going to benefit you because we haven't taken you in context of what your particular issues are.
Okay, let's talk about another alternative. What is the breath hold index?
The breath hold index. So breath hold index is, I'll tell you what it is. So basically you're sitting, you're breathing easily, 3 seconds in and out through your nose. You might do that for half a minute, 3 seconds in, 3 seconds out. Then you exhale for 3 seconds, and then you hold your breath. You stop.
Yep.
Okay. And then you're going to hold your breath until your first sort of I need air.
Yeah.
Right? You're not pushing it past that I need air. And the way you know that you didn't go too long is you can then take another easy nasal breath and exhale, and you're back to your baseline.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
So if you had to breathe hard and and your pulse is up and you're pushing it, that's way too far.
Yeah.
So it's a bit subjective, but you've done it a few times now, and I do it regularly. You know once you've done this a number of times what your baseline is.
Okay, so you're feeling an urge to breathe, and subjectively you have to sort of calibrate that and say, yep, this is the urge to breathe. I'm going to stop my timer, and then you have a time.
Yes.
And the longer you can hold your breath,
before that urge to breathe
Yeah.
is a marker of sort of carbon dioxide adaptation. And carbon dioxide, and it also ties into the autonomic nervous system. It overlays with the orthostatic heart rate.
Yeah.
So when you're in a calm state, your breath hold can be longer when you're in a parasympathetic state. When you are in a healthy state, your breath hold is longer. And I'll give you a couple examples. I'll give you a real world example of breath hold capacity in that case as a function of mitochondrial efficiency and autonomic nervous system health or resiliency. Anyone who's a swimmer, like a master swimmer or swam in college, has done hypoxic sets. Okay. You will swim, not breathing, not turning your head side to side. And this is actually something I didn't realize. I sort of knew they did, but I didn't think about it. A friend of our family is a master swimmer and said, we do these, I was talking about breath holds, because we do these hypoxic sets. And she said, well, we do these because you don't want to turn your head side to side, so it just makes you go faster because you don't have to turn your head side.
Sure.
So yeah, sure. And it struck me, I go, and let me propose something else to you. And she said, the best swimmers are the ones that can go the longest.
I bet.
Right? So she was thinking they're the best swimmers because they don't have to turn their head side to side. And I said, what if they're the best swimmers because they can hold their breath longer?
Right.
Their mitochondrial, their carbon dioxide tolerance is higher. Their mitochondria are more efficient. Their autonomic nervous system is more resilient. And she goes, oh, that makes sense because when I don't sleep well or I'm stressed or I'm rushed to go swimming, hypoxic sets are awful. I can't do anything, and I never really understood that.
Yeah.
Right? So here is stress. It's a marker of her capacity because her autonomic nervous system was stressed. I do this as a regular marker of my resilience every morning.
You do a breath hold index.
I do a breath hold. Now, I've been doing this 4 or 5 months, right? So I've had a couple examples recently where I got a virus. It's rare. All of a sudden, my breath hold tanked the day before. I'm like, what the heck?
Because your body's working on something.
Something. So why can't I go more than 30?
Yeah.
And lo and behold, something came up.
Yep.
Another time, I was driving my wife to a race. It was like a 10-hour drive, and we woke up early, and we got in really late, and she had hurt herself, and we got in at 2 in the morning, and it was really stressful. And the next morning I did it. I was like, I'm normally 40, 45 seconds at that time. I went 28 seconds. Like, what the heck, right? I have worked up to now breath hold in the morning about 70 seconds. And we can talk about that's an elite breath hold. So over 40 to 60 is great. Over 60, you're sort of getting into really elite CO2 tolerance. Less than 40 or less than 30 is not good. On the plane yesterday, I did it, flying out here. I was tired.
Was stressful.
It was stressful. I was low 30s.
Okay. Not good for you.
Not good for me, right? Got here, calmed down, got something to eat, and I was in the 40s.
Yeah.
Went into the cold tub.
So you're off the plane and you recovered a little bit.
Right? Got into the cold tub for 2.5, almost 3 minutes, and I was up to 70.
That's incredible.
Right?
So your ice bath, which 32 degrees, this is way cold, for 2 minutes, we'd think that's a very stressful event.
Right.
That it might be reflected in a lower breath hold index because of the stress you've put on your body. Now your resources are depleted because you went through the cold plunge experience. But just the opposite happened. Your breath hold index leapt up as if you had never flown. And you're back at this 70 seconds.
Which is really rare for me to be a minute 10 during the day, right? Because typically that would just be in the morning after a good sleep, recovery at the most calm point of the day. And
now you've crossed 3 time zones.
Right.
You're in Phoenix, Arizona at 115 degrees, and you got up to 70 seconds on your breath hold.
Which is really cool.
By what mechanism does that work?
Again, it's an autonomic nervous system reset, right? It didn't change my CO2 tolerance, right? So there's multiple mechanisms that it could work, but just think it was that autonomic nervous system reset that happened from the cold. And why that happens, it could be membrane potentials, it could be,
Sure. Yeah.
we can go into the potential pathways.
If I understand what you're saying correctly, you get into the ice bath and there's an immediate sympathetic
sympathetic,
activation.
right.
You get into the ice bath and you have the fight or flight response. And for me, that's the gasp reflex in about 30 seconds of what feels like panic, I'm going to die. And then the other minute and a half, 2 minutes that you're in there, your pulse goes down. Actually, your rate of oxygen consumption goes down, even as your metabolism is revving up through cold thermogenesis. It's kind of paradoxical. Your brain waves begin to lengthen out, and a sense of calm comes over me, and we have data that this happens to other people. That is the parasympathetic.
That is the parasympathetic response, right?
When you complete that cycle, I think what you're saying about the autonomic nervous system, because there's the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division, when you complete that cycle, I think what you're saying is that the ice bath resets the autonomic nervous system as if it wiped off the whiteboard of stress, all the scribbles from your flight, and allowed you to start over as if you were just waking up.
Correct. So we took about 15 minutes to get out of the freeze, a little shiver. I did some push-ups. I did a little movement outside.
Yeah.
And we checked everything 15 minutes later. And we also did a voice scan, right?
So we're going to talk about the voice scan.
So we're going to talk about, but it correlated with, and that's the breath hold index improved significantly. So now there's 2 points I want to make. That was me, right? So I have a decent resiliency, right?
Yeah.
I do breath holds. I do a number of things to focus on resiliency. That may not have worked with everyone.
Right. Okay.
Someone who doesn't have the resiliency or hasn't trained that or really hasn't focused on that could have taken the same flight, or maybe their breath hold was only 30 max and done cold at 4 in the afternoon or whatever it was, and they would not have had that response. It could have tanked them.
Still, we've seen the potential of
No,
the ice bath.
It's potential. It's just
Okay.
the key is individualization and knowing what's too cold and when. And that's sort of the important thing is individualization and knowing where to.
And you can measure this.
And you can measure that. We did it again today. You and I went to a colleague's.
We went to Sean Drake's portal in Scottsdale, Arizona. We went through the Shiftwave. We did Solodome, and we did PEMF.
Correct.
And it was in the Solodome acoustic chairs that you did a breath hold experiment.
Exactly. So I did a breath hold. I just felt like really, really calm. I just felt this
And
wave.
this is while you were in the acoustic chair and the frequencies
And
are playing.
I tapped Tom. I was like, let's do a breath hold, right?
Yeah.
And I did a breath hold, and I went 80 seconds.
Yeah.
Which is the longest.
spectacular.
Spectacular. So I was in this really deep sympathetic state.
Sympathetic or
Parasympathetic state, correct.
Okay,
And I
yeah.
was able to go 80 seconds, which is the longest I've ever gone. It was like I was literally waiting, it's like, when am I going to take a breath, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, how come I'm not taking a breath?
Yeah.
And it's like, eventually, okay, I'm going to take a breath now. So to me, that was such a visceral response of, I felt calm, but just it was a proof that something significant was happening in response to that experience.
Yeah.
And then we did Shiftwave. And Shiftwave uses well, it's not vibroacoustic, but physical, how would you call it? Like,
It's vibration.
it's vibrate, right?
Yeah.
So uses this vibrational.
It's not exactly a massage, but
right.
on your back.
So
yeah.
it's in some ways doing, in short terms, exactly what the cold did to me. And so you had this wave of sympathetic stress, and then it stopped. And it was like, whoa, right? So you immediately felt a sense of relaxation. So it was a little bit of a challenge and then relaxation. So it was training your body or your nervous system to have a little bit of a challenge. I had turned up all the way.
Yeah.
Did you have all
Me
the way?
too. Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So it was not uncomfortable, but it was like,
Yeah.
okay, it was fine. And that's the vowel. And that's the verb, health, right? That's resilience, the ability to take that stressor response and become achieve an adaptation from that,
Okay.
right? So if that didn't work, and it's a way to work around that by training the system.
You did something else yesterday when you were tracking your before-after ice bath experience. You mentioned a voice
Scan. Mhm.
Tell me about the voice scan.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, and I'm an engineer like you are, right? So my background's, I'm a physician, but I'm really more of an engineer at heart. Like biomedical engineering was my background. So I look at patterns, and I think in engineering, I look at solutions and how you can use a particular tool, maybe in a way that hasn't been used.
All right.
Right. So I reframe things and it's like, well, how can we use that? Or even how can we use that and interpret the data through another lens?
Yeah.
Because maybe we're looking at the thing in a completely different way.
Yeah.
So voice scans. So voice, and let's use something that we know. And I go back to my wife, right? She's very metabolically fit, right? And last year sometime I heard her yell out to her dog, and it just a moment, I was like, my wife doesn't sound any different than she did when she was 25. I was like, oh my gosh, it was like it was a deja vu of some other time I'd heard her say something really similar. I'd go, oh my gosh, right? It's like, voice, why hasn't her voice changed?
Yeah.
And then I started researching voice, and voice is autonomic nervous system.
Yes.
Just like the heart, it has
Very much so.
Has frequencies, right?
Yeah.
And voice is connective tissue, right? Just like connective tissue in the rest of your body. Voice is breath, right? Try talking when you're out of breath. Doesn't, right? Voice is resonance, and getting back to these frequencies. And voice is mitochondria.
How is voice mitochondria?
It's the energy production to produce those frequencies.
You need energy to produce those frequencies? I thought you just had vocal cords and they vibrate.
It's right, but you need energy to produce the breath.
Yes.
And you need energy that has the frequency within those, right? So it's not a static, it's not it's not a saxophone, right? You're not just blowing air through. It's a dynamic, there's muscles. So it's a dynamic structure.
Okay.
Or mechanism per se. And and then it was sort of ironic, is like, I talked to my mom who's getting older and her health is not very good. And I heard her voice on the phone. I was like, oh my gosh. It's like, she became a little old lady.
Yeah.
Right? It's like very tinny.
Right.
It's like, what happened over the past 5 years? This very more robust voice as her health declined.
Rick, this is a brilliant intuition.
And I'm like, oh my gosh. So I started doing some research, and I knew that we have a PMF device that uses voice analysis to look at frequencies to determine patterns of health. And then it comes out to, they adjust the PMF on that. Okay, that's cool, but they're not analyzing in a way that I could quantify. It's like they're not using that as an algorithm. And I know there's companies that have tried to use voice as a predictor of disease.
Interesting.
Okay. They failed, 2 of them, right?
Okay.
Because 2 reasons. One is they were looking at the endpoint. They were trying to look at what happens in the voice and your percentage. They were trying to go population-based. What's your likelihood of Parkinson's? What's your likelihood of cardiovascular disease? So not only they were trying to leapfrog, and I'll get back to that, but then they had to deal with FDA and medical diagnosis and make it acceptable. So it was going down this long road, and they were missing the point. The point is, voice is a dynamic indicator of your current resilience, right? What these frequency patterns, it's a marker of your state of health. Maybe not health, but a dynamic marker of where you are. And you can analyze voice in a similar way. You can look at cardiac frequency analysis, or what people call heart rate variability.
All right.
Right? So it's another way, and when you look at it dynamically and you analyze voice that way, it becomes a marker that you can track over time And not, you can track it on a day-to-day basis, and you can track it trending. And now so that became, oh my gosh, now we have this really cool dynamic marker of what my health is.
How did it work when you were testing it yesterday? You spoke into your phone and you had an app analyze your voice.
Right.
You did the ice bath. You did 15 minutes of rewarming, some exercises, you got some sun, and you spoke into your phone again.
Correct.
To have the app. And okay, so this app listens to you speak, and then what does it say?
Oh, it analyzes the frequencies.
Yeah.
And using AI today, right?
Yeah.
So it was able to analyze each of the frequencies and share, hey, it correlated with the breath hold and the cold, right? There was a shift
so?
into a more parasympathetic mode. The frequencies, the timbre had changed. The strength of the voice was a more resilient.
You sounded the same to me, right?
Right. So we don't hear it,
Yeah.
right?
Sometimes we do, actually.
So sometimes we hear it, right?
When someone is public speaking or they're singing,
And there's that fatigue that can
Yeah.
occur, right? So you can hear.
it's more than that. The anxiety will show up in the voice. Sometimes the voice gets higher because you become more anxious. Right.
Correct. So, but using an algorithm now, it picks up things that we wouldn't hear. It picks
Right.
up these frequency modulations that
Yep.
we don't hear. And we can hear them, like I heard my wife and my mother, and anxiety, right?
Yeah.
Why does the voice change? You're tightening, your
Yeah.
vocal cords are constricting, you're not using oxygen, you're not breathing in it,
Yep.
right? When you get anxious, you don't breathe as much. So that correlated it, and we did it today. I do this regularly, but we did it with Sean today, and it's a similar
Sean
thing.
Drake, yeah.
Right? And he's very resilient, right? So it correlated with some of the other metrics that we did with him.
And
So
how
really
long
cool.
does it take to do one of these voice scans?
20 to 30 seconds.
You just talk for a little bit?
Yeah, we have
and
a.
it
You
gives
can
a read.
talk. You can just talk normally. As part of our morning assessment set, we have a dialogue. We sort of say, okay, how are you feeling this morning? How did you sleep on a scale of 1 to
Do you
10?
have to say the same thing? Like
You-
four
you-
score and 20 years
You
ago
don't,
or
but
something?
for a consistency of pattern,
Yeah.
right? Just so we have, it's like we'll ask them those two questions, and we have them go A, E, I, O, U.
Okay.
And hold that, so
Yeah.
so we're getting a more consistent.
Yep.
We're not changing words or pace.
Now let's talk about how we might apply this.
Okay.
We do a voice scan, and we find out that our score, which is a description of our resilience, it's low. We got a big meeting, we got a big presentation coming up, and we're like, oh my God, my adaptive capacity is running low. Maybe I'm not ready. What would you do?
Well, if you knew, right, so everyone's going to have, because we're not just looking at voice scan, we're looking at a few other metrics, right? So we have an AM set of metrics, like we talk breath hold, orthostatic heart rate, we do a heart spectral analysis, we do a voice scan, and we also measure certain metrics in urine.
Okay, but we get a suite of
So we have
metrics,
we have a suite
right.
of metrics.
And they say, this
Right.
morning, you're not at your most resilient
You're not
adaptive
your most,
self.
so we have, every person is going to have a tool set.
Okay.
And there's some fundamental tool sets that you're going to use on a regular basis,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're going to have your special tools that
Okay, give me an example of a fundamental tool.
A fundamental tool would be doing some breath work. There's some
Okay.
particular breath work that we do. A fundamental tool is mineral-based water. A fundamental tool is bicarbonate. We actually make magnesium bicarbonate, which is, it's like, what? Magnesium bicarbonate, the best way to bring in magnesium, which is really critical to the electron transport chain and energy production, is in water, right? Mineral water.
Okay, so this is magnesium, Mg, and then there are two bicarbonate molecules, which is the HCO3. Then
Right.
there's two of those attached to the magnesium, so it's charge balance. When you dissolve this in water, there's now an Mg+2 ion and an HCO.
Right. You start with magnesium hydroxide.
Okay.
And you mix it in carbonated water.
Okay. Yep.
And then you can make magnesium bicarbonate.
Right. And they're dissolved in the water
And
as
it's dissolved
ions,
in
right?
pretty well. Some will,
Okay.
depending how you make it, it can precipitate a little bit out.
Okay.
But the absorption of that is significantly greater, and that becomes a regular tool.
And you like this better than magnesium citrate or
Yeah,
glycinate
it's like
or
a million times
L-threonate?
better. Yeah, we didn't get magnesium in a salt form. Doesn't exist in we got magnesium through swimming in seawater. We got magnesium primarily through water and some in food.
Okay, so what you're saying is there are no magnesium chloride salt mines. That's not where we got magnesium.
No.
We might go in the ocean and get some transdermal absorption, but this form of magnesium, this magnesium bicarbonate form, you like it better because you get the magnesium benefits and you also get some pH buffering?
Yeah, the bicarbonate is the pH buffering. So one of the urine metrics we look at is pH, we look at oxidative redox potential, and we look at conductivity.
Okay.
Okay, and we can explain those, but those are 3 metrics. A key one is pH, especially if you track it. It can vary, but if you track it regularly, and these 3 metrics are based on the work of this guy, Louis, hydrologist, Louis Claude Vincent in the 40s and 50s.
Okay.
And he understood the importance of these characteristics in water, right? And he knew clean water had certain traits, which then he was able to adapt in looking at urine. And he did a number of different studies and came up with some calculations.
We're talking about measuring the pH
Right.
of your pee, the acidity
Correct.
of what you pee out in the morning.
Correct. So if your pH is really low, an ideal pH in the morning is about 6.8.
That's very close to neutral.
Yeah, so
7
that's-
is neutral.
Yeah, 6.8, 7 is good. If you're starting to push 7.2, there could be some issue as well.
Okay.
And I see that with athletes. I see that, and I see it with my wife all the time, less with me because I don't push as hard. But when she works out really hard the next morning, if we don't buffer her, she's in the 5s.
Wow.
Right?
So that's
she's
very acidic.
very, very acidic. So we know whenever she's going to race, and even after a race, when she has this large lactic acid dump, right, we need to buffer her.
So the lactic acid is showing up in her urine, and that's lowering the pH of her urine because acids have low pH, bases have high pH.
Correct.
Okay.
Exactly. So, and it's also, she starts to lose salt, and then your body starts to burn through magnesium, and you see people with low serum magnesium, and we try and push, and this was like a realization to me. It's like, oh my gosh, like I'm trying to take someone, this athlete with low serum magnesium, and I'm just trying to give them a magnesium salt. Like, what am I doing? Like, we need to buffer their urine so they don't burn through magnesium and they don't have to use it as part of the buffering process, and give them magnesium in a more natural state. And you get, like you just said, you get both
Okay.
in the same ancestral wisdom source, right? You're
Magnesium is one of those tricky blood markers because only like 1% of your total body burden of magnesium is contained in your blood.
Correct.
Most of it is stored in your bones and some in your muscles. And so if you're going in to get your labs done and you get magnesium measured, it means nothing.
You have to use red cell magnesium, which is
Okay.
not perfect,
Yeah.
but it definitely correlates well. So I see people, low pH, low red cell magnesium, athletes pushing. There's a clear correlation. And now with
that's
the
helpful.
understanding of pH and some of these other markers, ORP and so forth, and breath hold, it was like, oh, okay, this is why this person can never catch up. And I see people that are a gram of magnesium, they can never catch up. I always thought they weren't absorbing it. And yes, it's possible. And from someone I did some work with who taught me a lot about copper iron dysregulation in the mitochondria, and magnesium and the electron transport change, it was like he calls it a magnesium burn rate. And
This is very true. Magnesium is an element. Your body can't make magnesium. It must come from the diet. And when you get into the cold bath, for example, this magnesium stored in your bones will be released into the bloodstream so it can reach the mitochondria in your brown fat, where it performs these
didn't know that. Yeah.
essential
Okay.
roles in the activity of mitochondria. It catalyzes through the enzymes in which it is incorporated hundreds of metabolic reactions. And yet, it's not like it goes back into the bones after you've revved up the metabolism. You will pee it out, and it must be replenished, or your bones will become depleted.
Right.
And so this magnesium balance is essential for your metabolism, and yet often overlooked.
And the key point here is the acidity and the lack of the ability to buffer properly is driving this depletion of magnesium. And the other key point I understand now is, yes, we get it from the diet, but again, think back of, so, you have to eat nuts, you have to eat chocolate. Who ate that?
Nobody.
No one did, right?
Yeah.
So why are we telling people to eat all this magnesium from these foods that 200 years ago they never ate and they never had any problem, right?
But they did have green leafy vegetables 200 years ago, at least in season. And
Okay, so go to the Inuits or go to people who didn't have green leafy
It's a
vegetables.
great point.
Right?
Yeah,
They
right.
got it in other ways. They got
Yeah.
it from water.
No
Right?
kidding.
That's their prime source. So we think of magnesium in a more traditional, it's water. And that's bicarbonate water is probably your best way to obtain it. Not that you don't get it from diet, right? But there's a piece that we've missed.
Okay, I think I'm understanding why you would measure the pH of the urine. Why would anybody measure the redox potential, or the ORP, oxidation reduction potential, of their pee?
Right. So getting back gets complicated. So we have oxidative redox potential, there's conductivity, and there's pH. And these all, without getting too complicated, these all tell us about how your body is acting in a balanced electrical state. We'll just keep it at that, right? When the analogy is, we talked about, we tend to think the body transfers things through ions, right? Magnesium, calcium, sodium, potassium,
Sure.
and et cetera. But honestly, like you said before, it's protons. It's bioelectrically how things are processed.
Okay, let's clarify this.
Yeah.
In machines, charge moves through electrons that travels over wires, and we sort of understand this as engineers. In the body, we don't have wiring. Charge moves on the proton. Now, there's no such thing as charge that is not held in a molecule in the body. So charge always has a material embodiment in the body. And the way it moves is by proton. They have to be, there are proton gradients, there are proton pumps. Protons have to move across membranes. Protons are a lot bigger than electrons are.
Right.
So the electrons
Protons are positively charged.
Yep.
Particles, electrons are negatively charged.
You got it.
Particles, neutrons have no charge, right?
Okay.
So just to clarify that.
And so within the body, charge moves because the charge is in a molecule. It's an ion. Electrons move this way, and protons, which would be really the smallest material unit of charge within the body, they move that way as well. And I think where you're going with this is that when you measure the redox potential of the pee, you gain some insight into how charge is moving within the body.
Exactly.
Tell
and
me
when
about
you
that.
and when you measure the conductivity, or actually by measuring conductivity, you're measuring resistance. You're also measuring the entropy of these ions, right? So sort of the scatterability or the control nature. So when the body sort of take a room full of kindergartners that are just running all over the place, and you're the teacher, what do you have to do? You have to get them to it takes a lot of energy, right? Take some kids who are or coloring, or they're doing projects. Everything's nice and calm. You're happy, right?
Ordered. Yeah.
It's order. When the body has to deal with this entropy or craziness, it takes energy to do that. When the body has this form of resistance, which is a sign of the scatterability of these ions, means the ions are more in a lower entropy state, and the body transmits energy through protons.
This sounds imprecise to me. When I was in engineering grad school, I'm getting my doctorate, I was working in heavy duty in thermodynamics. I discovered there are 27 different definitions of entropy in the scientific literature. And now on social media, people use this term entropy as if it were a poetic, whatever you want. The best definition that I read was, if you play the movie backwards and people laugh, that's entropy. That is, entropy in this case is the arrow of time. It is always increasing. We're always sort of becoming more disordered. Unless there is the input of an exogenous or an outside constant stream of, sometimes it's called negative entropy, sometimes it's called energy. The best word that I've seen is exergy. It is exergy that will maintain order in the face of a constant entropic increase towards disorder.
Right.
But how is that represented in
the
conductivity?
Exactly. So I think the key is, without getting too deep into it, is understand these three markers are sort of working together to give us a sense of, it's not really energy capacity, but the state of almost the charge of the cell, the state of the ability to move energy. And I think that's the biggest component here. And it's a correlation, and we've talked about it. Someday we'll have an ability to measure charge of the mitochondria and the charge of the cells, but it gives us a correlation. And Claude Vincent has a particular formula which we used and adapted to get a state using these three markers as a both a dynamic and a predictive state of that resiliency of the body. When energy is being lost, the body is in a less resilient state. And we take this particular metric and correlate it now with these other markers, and we start to have this dynamic picture of the state of this person, and we know where the weakness is. And less important to exactly we could talk forever, and at some point I'll tap out with what my understanding is, being more engineering translational. It's like I know it enough. I know it enough to sort of how are we going to use this, as opposed to exactly, because I leave that for the academics, right? I leave that to you.
I'm going to return to my engineering resilience analogy. One of the things that's difficult in engineering infrastructure systems is to gauge how hard the system is working to maintain the current state. So we could be talking about the electric grid. It is 115 degrees in Phoenix this afternoon. There's an extreme heat warning. If it gets any hotter, they're going to shut down the regional flights at the Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport because those jets aren't rated to go above 119. Now that's an infrastructure threshold where 115 you're fine, 116 you're fine, 117 you're fine, 118 let them fly, 119 and it all shuts down. What we don't have good measures for example, in the electric grid, is how far are we from the threshold, and how hard is the system working to keep the voltage, to keep the power in the grid going when everybody has their air conditioning on. The same thing is true in flight. You might have an autopilot, and the autopilot is flying, between two destinations. The pilot has no information on how hard the autopilot is working to keep the plane stable under these conditions. Once the conditions overwhelm the autopilot's capacity, the autopilot switches off, hands it back to the pilot, says, "This is your problem now." And sometimes in that transition, because the pilot didn't know, all the state variables looked good, we didn't know how hard the system was working to maintain homeostasis,
exactly,
which would be the word for the body.
Right. So it's sort of, we all have been under stressful situations, and we rose to that, whether it's someone who's ill or doing a 5-day stage race or whatever it might be. And it was like, and you pushed yourself through it, right? You used your reserve.
Correct.
And then, and you're okay, right? You knew you were pushing yourself, but then it ends.
And then, you might collapse.
And then it's like, boom, right? So you've
because you were working so hard to maintain these state variables of performance. Okay.
Right.
Now, what I'm gathering,
but we can get, I guess the point is we can gauge that.
from the urine, from the waste product, you can get a sense of how hard the body is working to maintain this homeostatic state.
From the urine, right? From the urine energetics, along with these other markers, right?
Yeah.
So Claude Vincent, he used just those, right? But when we start to layer on these other markers, we add a depth and layering to it, which gives us even greater ability to understand what's going on, and then a greater ability to understand when to intervene and how to intervene.
Rick, tell me about visual contrast as an assessment of resilience.
Got it. So here is another sort of repurposed marker. We know that the eyes have one of the most densely concentrated cellular mitochondrial capacity.
The retina.
The retina
extremely dense in mitochondria, which suggests to us that processing visual signals must be an incredibly energy-intensive process.
Correct. We also know through the work of Glenn Jeffrey at University College of London, who's done a lot of work with red light, and sort of just as a tangent, Glenn Jeffrey showed that when he shined red light on people, he's done a number of things, but glucose levels declined.
They go down.
Right?
Because the red stimulates activity in the mitochondria.
When he shined blue light on people, glucose levels went up.
Interesting.
So staring in front of your computer all day may be worse than what you ate.
Yeah.
And that's what he actually showed. So Glenn Jeffries, I've had some conversations with him. He shared with me one of the tests that he does in his laboratory. It's called a Farnsworth test. Farnsworth test literally uses 100 different shades of colors, and you have to sort of match the colors and find out at what point you can no longer tell the difference in the color variation.
This sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, so it's
never let the engineers pick colors.
Yeah.
That was my rule in construction.
Mm-hmm. But it's a good sense of how efficient you are able to pick this color variation is a sense of your mitochondrial function. So that's one marker that we're going to repurpose on a phone. It's not as precise, but it's a way that we can gauge mitochondrial function. The other thing is contrast. There is some online tests which we'll introduce into an app that look at shading. So you can look at colors and you can look at shading, in grays from light to dark. This has been used predominantly for mold and toxicity, metal toxicity. It was realized by Shoemaker that people who had mold toxicity lost their ability to have contrast. I was like, okay, clearly the mold is affecting mitochondrial function.
Correct.
Right? So I said, what if we take healthy people and use contrast and color as a way to track trends over time? So as we begin to introduce interventions, whether it's magnesium bicarbonate or breath hold or a regenerative therapy, whatever it might be, or a particular exercise or anything that would be most appropriate for the person, we should see through a mitochondrial lens, because for me, we've talked about energy production and communication of mitochondria being one of the most important things for health and resilience. This color and this contrast sensitivity will improve. It's slow, but if you do it monthly, it takes 5-10 minutes to do, you can start to see trends. And that's a powerful sign that something is moving in the right direction and you're achieving a more efficient mitochondrial function.
A number of my readers have reported to me an improvement, temporary improvement in visual acuity when they come out of the ice bath.
There you go.
They will come out of the ice bath and subjectively they'll say, my vision is sharper.
Right.
And it might be better tuned to contrast. It might be they're picking up colors, or it might just be things are focused a little tighter. And I've always said, the ice bath stimulates mitochondrial function, and over the little bit longer term, mitobiogenesis, so it'll improve the quality and density of your mitochondria. But in that stimulation, it might make sense that the mitochondria in their retina, on which vision depends, is revved up a little bit.
Absolutely, and I haven't tried that yet. I mean, that could be a really interesting. We know light affects mitochondria.
Sure.
So Glenn's
Yep.
already told us that light improves color perception. So why wouldn't cold do the same thing?
Right.
And you're already hearing subjective responses like, hey, I see clearer. So clearly, I would expect that VCS and Farnsworth color would have the same response.
Okay. We now have this idea that health is a form of resilience.
Mm-hmm.
Resilience is in general, the capacity to adapt to changing conditions. Some people think that Charles Darwin said it was survival of the fittest. It's not what he said. He said the survival of the most adaptive.
Mm-hmm.
It was a contemporary of Darwin who was citing him, who coined this phrase, survival of the fittest. And it is a misconception about the ideas that Darwin was trying to put out in the world. So health is a special form of this adaptation. It is not a state. It is the difference between two states. It is best thought of as a verb rather than as a noun. And you've given us a number of examples, and I know it's not exhaustive, you have more, but
Yeah.
you've given us a number of examples of how to get at this health as a verb state.
Correct.
Why can't I just get my labs done and I'm all set? Because that's what my medical doctor tells me to do.
Yeah. Do we have another 2 hours
No.
to do this? No, we don't. Okay, labs are static, right? They're points in time. They look in the past, right? Labs, the way they look at, way we use them now, are pathologically based. They're looking for particular markers that are signs of high pathology.
Okay, so you get an HbA1c that's over 7, you got type 2 diabetes.
Right.
Thank you, lab.
Or they're looking, I'll let you say this, they're looking for ways that you can be medicated.
Sure.
Your cholesterol, your LDL, or APO, you need a statin. Well,
Yeah.
no one needed a statin
That's
120 years
nonsense.
ago, right?
Yeah.
Their mitochondria were a lot healthier.
Yeah.
Wasn't a problem. So individually focused markers, we talked about it being a reductionist system. These are your liver enzymes, these are your kidney function, this is your, this is your glucose. Well,
As if all these different organs were independent parts of the factory that is your body.
Right.
And you could swap one out, or you could, supplement one part of this factory, and it wouldn't affect the assembly line of proteins or whatever this
Exactly.
factory metaphor is. And that's all a bunch of nonsense.
Correct.
Because
So-
the body is a complex system.
right. So they are two ways to use labs. One is obviously look for something really out of range.
That it could
But
be
that's
helpful.
right. So
Yeah.
labs developed out of a pathological hospital-based way to monitor people who were ill, right? We were able to, it's like the tax code. It sort of developed, and we have this old way of looking at things. But when I'll say you can re-engineer that, and you can start to look at patterns. So just like you can see dynamic patterns, you can look at how patterns such as GGT and uric acid and insulin, or even a lipid, might interplay, and what that means. So you can get a lot more out of labs than what we do, and if you start to look at it as a pattern and you don't get focused on individual organ pathology. And that's easy to do now with algorithms,
Okay.
especially if you give it rule sets based on certain patterns. So it's useful in that way, but it doesn't give you anything dynamic. And then also, whether it's a standard serum chemistry or even more advanced markers that, fibrinogen, homocysteine, iron saturation, RBC magnesium, there's certain key ones. So for me, I'm always looking for iron copper dysregulation, because that's a focused mitochondrial. I switch my lens to how do I look at labs through a mitochondrial lens. What would the body be doing if redox is up? Well, it raises homocysteine. It's pulling glutathione. Your GGT is going down. Your uric acid is going up. Okay, these are markers of this discordance or coherence. but it doesn't tell us what to do on that dynamic basis. You can use these, but they're slow, right? What are you going to do them another 3-4 months? What if where do you go with these? And you can get a sense of, even if you do an epigenetic test, a telomere test, or they're even slower and more expensive. And what do you do with them? And what if you did the wrong thing? Now you're at $400 or $500 and I have to do it again. Virtually no one does it again. Or I do it again in a year. That's really, really slow. So labs are dumb. They're useful to make sure there's nothing really out of range. And they're useful to confirm that the dynamic markers are being optimized and you're not missing anything.
Okay.
Right? Because it's more of a downstream, because it's all bioenergy, bioelectricity, biomagnetism first. And if that's working, then that means the mitochondria are working. If the mitochondria are working, everything else should be working well.
Right.
And yeah, there could be you can have a great car that has, we got a nail in our tire the other day. Okay, we need to fix that.
That's like an injury.
It's an injury,
and you
right?
need your mitochondria to repair that.
We need, right. So yes, there can be things you pick up. So we can't think of labs as our real tool set for health. It's static. Useful, especially if looked as patterns, but virtually no one looks at it as a pattern. It's still reductionist, each one separately, and you'll get a report from any of the 40 labs online. They break down every marker, and they're trying to explain this marker is related to this disease, and this one's high and this one's low. I'm not saying it doesn't mean anything, but they don't even take into account the person, because a marker that could be high in one person could be bad.
Sure.
And a marker is high in another person could be good. And a marker that could be high in association with another marker is fine, right? So you have to look at context, and that's really, really important.
You're not a big fan of the labs because they're not dynamic. They cannot capture the verb.
They're not a verb, correct.
The capacity of the body to respond to stress or to recover from stress, which is our understanding of health and resilience.
In a non-pathological hospital, non-hospital setting, right? If you're actively managing and you're drawing electrolytes and you're, someone's in ketoacidosis and they're out of, sure.
Yeah, we want to know that. You're right.
You absolutely need to, because you have a system that's really dynamic at that point, because it's trying to find its coherence.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But if you're looking at long-term health, we've taken pathology, we've tried to take it onto long-term resilience and longevity.
Gotcha.
Doesn't work.
That makes total sense. So labs could identify an acute present condition that's pathological because they're way out of range.
Correct.
It is not a tool for health, longevity, resilience.
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
Right? So we have non-engineers guiding health, longevity.
Yeah.
We have academics and physicians trained in disease, primarily trying to understand dynamic. And I'm not taking anything away. It's just that's how we were trained.
Yeah.
I happen to be trained differently.
Yeah.
Right? I always went in with this mindset.
Yeah.
So I never fell or I never sort of put on those glasses.
Yeah.
Right? I always kept like, this doesn't make sense.
Okay. Now that you have these measures of a health resilience, what do you do next?
Yeah. So there are two areas that my personal focus is in, and sort of as we've discussed, like performance, right? So to me, I've learned a lot from athletes, right? Because you have to optimize things, and they measure. They're the people who are really dynamic. Like my wife won't get on her bike without her power meter and her heart rate, because she knows that's how she needs to improve, right? So dynamic measurement is critical, and uploading Strava and looking at, climbing, and, it's a natural thing, doing particular metabolic testing. It doesn't have to be with a mask, but, measuring what their functional threshold is, looking at how they clear lactate, really important. Now, they're not looking at it from a health longevity perspective, they're looking at a performance perspective.
Right.
But you can still take that information. The other thing is my background in many years was with my son in the baseball world. It was very high performance. He broke down due to injuries, and I wish I knew what I know now. But you look at athletes, and we don't look at why was one performing, a pitcher, let's say, why do they pitch really good one day and are absolutely awful the next day, right? Could it be travel? Could it be circadian rhythm? Could it be emotional argument with their wife? Could it be they didn't sleep well that night, or whatever it might be? Could it be they're getting older and they're losing their resiliency, so they tend to wobble more, right? So one of the reasons I came here, obviously, is to meet with Sean. And
this is Sean Drake in Scottsdale.
Sean Drake, who works with a lot of high-level athletes. And we're going to work with Sean and use Sean and a few of, sort of our group to understand how we can use this in performance and even get to the point where we could say, at least using a pitcher as an example, you shouldn't pitch today, right? Your metrics that we follow are really off. And, maybe same as a business meeting, you could try this metric to see if cold, or we could reset you in some way. But if we can't, you need to take another day, and it could be that one extra inning that you throw and ball looks like it's coming good, but boom, maybe you didn't have the kinesthetic capacity to hold, and your arm angle went just a little different, and that was enough stress. Just like you talked about, the levee broke. Why does someone blow his UCL? It's good, it's good, it's good.
We're talking about the threshold.
It's good, it's good, it's good, it's bad.
The water can go higher, 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 and everything's cool until it overtops the levee. And at that point, you have catastrophic failure.
Right.
From no flood to water.
Right. And if we could understand what the load is on that individual person, and it's going to be different.
And stay below that threshold.
We can stay below that threshold and get a warning light. So we can learn a lot from that, because at least the athletes are much more willing to look at this data. So by using that data and from our group, I want to then transfer this to the next space, which I'm interested in, is age resilience. We could call it, I don't call it longevity. It's to me, it's age resilience regeneration. I want to be as resilient or maintain resiliency as I get older.
Yeah.
Because if I can't be resilient, nothing's working.
Agreed.
Right? And once I'm resilient, then I can regenerate. How can you expect the body to regenerate if your batteries?
You cannot.
You cannot, right? So we take someone, we give them stem cells, and no one checks, literally. Please, if you're a regenerative doctor, tell me what you check. Virtually no one does, and I'm not blaming anyone. It's just we haven't had the tools. Now they might check a blood, but even then they treat people because people are sick, and they, it's financial. They need help, and that's okay. And people do well, and they don't do well. We don't really know. But if we spent time, which is what Sean and I were speaking about today, is like getting people's terrain and resiliency first, then all of a sudden you can regenerate in a much more powerful way.
That's great.
And one of the things we use is an IV PRP. We actually use IV platelets, which is sort of triage of the body. And these platelets can actually, when you take them from your body, when a body that's resilient, and put them back in, they can guide the body. So
you remove blood, you spin it down so that you have only the platelets left, and then you reinsert it in the bloodstream?
Yeah. So you move your own blood, right? We move about 120 to 150 mils, which is a lot more. People get injectable platelets, and it's different. It's the same, but it's different, right? They might only use 30 mils. So you spin it down, and you'll get, you'll spin it down, you'll separate the red cells from the platelets, and then you pull out sort of that yellow platelets with a little bit of red cells because there's an overlap, and then you spin it again, and now all the platelets settle at the bottom, and you get the platelet pore fraction at the top.
Okay.
And then you pull out about 15 mils of the bottom, because that's where the platelets are after the second spin. So now you take that 15 mils, which is very concentrated, of your own platelets that have been sort of reset. Okay, literally reset. It's like on off, right? They've gotten out of your body. They actually become more coherent, and then you put them back in, and they go in and they sort of tell your body what to do. They operate in, we call them a quantum, but they actually operate in a bioelectric way. I don't know if it's a quantum entanglement, but just like collective of bees or ants, that can, and birds in the sky that can just fly in patterns instantaneously. That's not a chemical signal, right? These aren't chemical signals that operate that quickly. They're working on a whole nother level.
Gotcha.
And we know that from the work of Michael Levin. Cells can work connective in batches and has nothing to do with DNA at all. So you put these platelets back in, and now they can start this regenerative process with your own cells. And there's other things to do as well, but that's a really cool lever to use. It's your own. No foreign material. But if you expect to do that or use exosomes or any cells, and you're in a incoherent state, and by that I mean some of these markers, which are a signpost, right? So if your pH is negative, your aura P, is off, your breath hold's only 25, your voice and heart rate scan are, really frequency patterns are not quite well, and you don't recover well.
So all these resiliency indices are looking bad right now.
Yeah. How do you expect the body to take cells and use them properly?
It's incapable.
It's not going to do it.
Yeah.
It's just not going to do it, right? And you get a less than positive result.
Yep.
So people need to be committed to that.
Now, when you do the platelet therapy, do you see improvement in these resilience measures?
Yes. Yeah. So I went, so breath holds, I've been 45 seconds for...
It seems pretty good. I've tried this breath hold.
For 45 seconds for weeks.
Yeah.
3 days after my first platelet, I went to 70 seconds.
That's an enormous improvement.
Enormous. And then I also do a different type of breath hold that involves taking an inhalation, and I do that in sets of 5 in the morning, and that's really training CO2 tolerance.
Okay.
And those I was doing like a minute 40, 100 seconds. I now go to 150, 2.5 minutes. So it literally went up 20%.
Yeah.
And it was like, what the heck? And then the other thing I noticed is for the first time, my orthostatic, my weakness, as I said, was like, I tend to be more sympathetically driven, and I made it worse. Made it worse by, I'm going to do intermittent fasting and not eat till 1 because it's good for me, right? Well, it was good for a while, but not, right? And I'm going to do HIIT training, and my orthostatic was 20 to 25 beats in the morning, and got worse when I picked up this virus. And for the first time, it was like 15 or 14
after the platelet therapy.
After the plate, we'll see if that holds after travel or not. And I suspect it will take a few of these to really start to layer in, the resilience. You can do them every 6 to 8 weeks, either, depending on the stress. And I'd like to add that into the athlete protocol, but it also fits into a resiliency protocol. And you can use these as your own blood. They're really easy to do, and it's a powerful lever that we can use to use the knowledge, and I think that's the most important thing. Our body knows more than we do, right? And what current Western medicine does in the long term, what's this molecule? What this pathway? What gene are we going to tweak? And I'll go back to Michael Levin, who's sort of taken the work of Robert Becker and Albert Szent-Györgyi before him, and Gerwith, and understanding that the body has this layered mechanism, right? And it's like going into an IBM mainframe computer and trying to move all the wires around, right? It's trying to resolder your keyboard on your laptop, where maybe all you need to do is a new software. It's like trying to take apart your cell phone that is not working anymore, but all it needs is a new battery, right? So this is where we think we can do, and the body is not even hardware, right? There's layers, and there's so even if we could particularly pinpoint a particular marker or pathway downstream, that doesn't mean we're going to get, right? That's the side effects. We get the effect we want, but we also get other effects.
Yeah.
Even if that molecule is super targeted,
Yeah.
we don't know for each individual person, what the overlaps are.
Of course not.
So the body knows better than we do.
Right.
Right? So if we can leverage the body's innate healing potential,
Let's do that.
let's do that,
Yeah.
right? But it only can do that if it's in a resilient state to begin with. That takes a little bit of time,
That sounds right.
right? And we can then sequence particular protocols and therapies and emotional work. Like emotions are heart is fear and emotions are decoherence, right? Think of them as a toxin, right? So all these things come together, and people connecting up, are healing. So there's many things we can start to bring together, but we need a way to gauge those. And I think QMT for me is like a way we can bridge.
Quantum mitochondrial terrain.
Yeah, we can bridge,
QMT.
and hopefully we'll be able to bridge to some other molecular tests. It's a powerful first step into giving everyone the ability to intuitively know, right? We should know. This isn't about using outside and other doctors. It's giving you the capacity to learn from your body and to pay attention. And the markers will guide you, but then you can say, hey, something is off.
Now you can experiment.
And now you can
Is
experiment.
that red light working for you? Is that supplement working for you? Is that exercise program working for you? Are the grounding sheets working for you? Nobody knows.
Nobody knows, right?
And now you have the indices by which we can indicate whether these interventions, these biohacks, or whatever it is that we're doing is working for us.
And maybe all that each person, maybe someone just needs to walk after dinner
Yeah.
and go out in the sun in the morning.
Yep.
And that's like the most important thing that they
Yeah.
can do and get a hug,
Yep.
right? Not urolithin A and, not some other probiotic. It's like,
Yeah.
that could be the biggest shift
Sure.
in you. And yeah, don't do things that are problematic for you, but we don't know. And, so listen to your body, and that will confirm that. So that's my hope, is people pay attention to what they intuitively know, because the doctor doesn't know.
I agree.
I don't know. I don't know what's good,
Well, Dr.
Doctor.
Cohen,
Right,
thanks for joining me.
yeah.
Yeah. I want you to update me.
Yeah.
And we'll update our viewers as you put these indices to the test, and we see whether you're able to improve the performance of athletes, executives.
Oh, we
and
will.
people
We
in
will be
general.
able to.
I
Yeah,
believe you.
we will be able
Yeah.
to. The challenge is going to be really initially, we'll have to do work more manually, but get it into a system or an app where everything is driven off your phone.
Yep.
And it'll just be easy, and all the numbers calculated and crunched, and then you get a dynamic telling you what to do.
This will be a big improvement.
Yes. Yes.
Thanks for telling us about it.
Cool. My pleasure. Thanks, Thomas.